You're listening to Talking to Teens, where we speak with leading experts from a variety of disciplines about the art and science of parenting teenagers. I'm your host, Andy Earle, creator of the Teenage Personality Quiz. Head to talkingtoteens.com for a free PDF explaining how your teenager thinks. We are here today with Jessica Lahey. She is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed. Jessica is an educator, speaker, and writer. She has worked as an English, Latin, and writing teacher in middle school and high school for more than a decade, and wrote the Parent-Teacher Conference advice column for the New York Times. She also writes for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and she's been on the radio, on the news, all over the place. She wrote this book, The Gift of Failure, 6 years ago, and it's considered an important voice in this growing movement among parenting experts to let kids fail. And so she has some amazing tips in this book that come from research and that also come from her own experiences in the classroom, and some really, really practical advice for parents. So I can't wait to dive in to all that and more. Jessica, thank you so much for making the time to come on the show today. This book, I feel like I see all over the place. I'm currently just in a stage where I'm doing a lot of traveling. I've been living 1 month in a different country each month and kind of traveling around.
Oh my gosh.
And so, yeah, it's been really cool. But I feel like I've been seeing your book all over the place. And specifically,
that's cool.
I was in South America earlier this year, and sometimes I just go into bookstores in different countries and see what parenting books I can find and what I recognize, and so your book was one of the few.
Did you tweet at me about this?
I must have done so. I think I sent a
I
picture
think
to
you
you or
did,
something.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because I was super excited. I found it in this bookstore in Argentina. And so anyway, so your book is everywhere. It's all over the world, and it's a really big deal. But how did it start?
Oh, so I've been a teacher I've been a teacher and a parent for the same amount of time. I started teaching when I was pregnant with my older son, who's now in college. And I've taught every grade from 6 to 12. And really, it came out of what I was seeing in my classroom, the concerns I had about my students being really reluctant to make mistakes, reluctant to, quote, look stupid, to, venture a guess at something they weren't sure they knew right off the bat. Writing rough drafts was hard for them because they were afraid they don't like to look anything other than perfect. And so my students, teachers tend to do that. When I say my kids, sometimes I mean my students, but my students were getting increasingly anxious. Levels of sort of this perfectionism that was tipping over into sort of an obsessive compulsive personality disorder was starting to happen. And I was really worried. And to be really, really frank, I was getting angry at the parents of my students, which is a really bad place to be because, all the research is clear on this, that when homeschool relationships are strong, kids learn better. And total humiliation, I realized I was doing the exact same thing that they were doing with my own kids. And so I had to have one of those moments where I said, it's really easy for me to blame the parents of my students for, quote, wrecking my students or making it so that they were less able to learn. And yet I'm doing the same thing to my own kids. So that's my favorite place to be from a writing perspective, something that's really important to me because it's, about my kids and the way my family works. And yet at the same time is about the research and becoming a better teacher. So it was so much fun. I did, 2 years pulling together all the research on motivation and how kids learn and how so-called helicopter parenting or highly directive parenting affects that. It's been a really fun ride.
So one thing that you point out in here kind of early on that I thought was a really good point was you kind of talk about where this comes from, or you call it how failure became a dirty word. And so you talk about how actually kind of a lot of times as a parent, those opportunities where you can kind of save the day for your kid are when you really feel good about yourself, or kind of when when you're able to kind of see something coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tempting to, seeing your kid frustrated is so horrifying. You don't want your kid to feel bad about themselves. You want your kid's self-esteem to be, so strong and so unbreakable. You want them to feel like they're triumphant all the time. And yet what we do is we interrupt that very process by taking a task away from them before they get a chance to feel triumphant about it. And we tend to underestimate what our kids might be able to do if we just gave them a chance to sort of stick with it for a little longer. And the problem with that is the more we take over for our kids and do things for them, not only do we convey the message to them that we don't think they can do it themselves, we also create this state of what's called learned helplessness, where kids feel increasingly paralyzed and increasingly helpless. And we're sort of feeding that cycle. And the worst part of it from a teaching perspective is when we make it so that our kids don't have much comfort with frustration, when they can't deal with their own frustration, when they can't push through and sort of cope with those feelings, they end up being less able to learn in school and in life, because the teaching tools that I use in my classroom that are most effective happen to be tools that require kids to wrestle with frustration a little bit and stick with difficult tasks until they complete them. So, we're trying our best to, make our kids feel comfortable and capable. And yet at the same time, we're actually doing the exact opposite, which, was kind of an eye opener for me as a parent.
Yeah, right. Part of the problem is the top-down nature of a lot of goal setting that happens in families, where the goals are really just directed by the parents. It's just kind of the things that the parent thinks will be best for the kid, but without necessarily including the kid in the process of
That's
setting
what's
the
so
goals.
crazy. We've got the kid right there in front of us, and yet one of the last things we think to do is to ask them how they envision a solution
Yeah,
to the
because
problem.
they just don't really have that much experience yet. They don't know really what's best for them.
Yeah, we may have more experience with sort of the details of like how I was using this example in an earlier, when I was talking to someone yesterday about how, for example, how to walk into an airport and get from point A to point B and board your flight. Yeah, we have more
Mm,
experience with that. But at the same time, with things like, I don't know, like doing your homework, kids doing their homework, we tend to, as parents, have a vision for how that's going to happen in this carefully curated communal space we've created in our house, because that's how we always envisioned it would look like in our home. But when we
yeah.
say to kids, sweetie, how and where and at what time and under what conditions would be your perfect homework day, and they obviously not doing homework can't be the answer, but how and where would you do it? And what was really interesting is when I finally thought to ask my kids, they had two very different answers to that. One wanted to do it the minute he got home from school so he could get it out of the way and do fun stuff that he wanted to do after. And the other had to do the fun stuff and get his heebie-jeebies out first before he could actually focus on the homework. So, the fact that I never thought to ask them, and it was my rule that you do homework the minute you get in the door so that you can get it done, didn't take any of their preferences into account and gave them no sense of autonomy over their homework, which in the end lowered the chances that they were going to be personally invested in getting the homework done. So, just
Yeah.
thinking to ask is a really great first step.
I feel like it's so easy to jump from, hey, I've tried everything and trust me, this is what works best, to, so this is what you should do. And instead of like just encouraging them to kind of have their own process of trial and error and discovering what works best from them. And it's just so hard because you've already gone through it, and you've already figured out this is totally the way to do it.
There are certain things that we kind of know we can't do that. I with my students, I always want to sort of, when I see them get broken hearts, like if they get dumped by the person they've been dating, and
Yeah.
that they just have to go through that. Like I was, I think a lot about the relationships that made me be the person I am. Some of them were not terribly pretty. Some of them were actually a little bit unhealthy, but that was, something I had to I had to deal with, and I had to become stronger and had to figure out what I wanted and what I didn't want in a relationship. And that was not a process someone else could do for me. So when I'm ready to step in on something that I'm like, oh, well, Mike, I've been through this. I know how this should work. I should just do this for you because I've got all the wisdom. I try to think of it more about in the terms of the way I would sort of think about a romantic relationship for them. I can't give them the experiences they need in order to know things about themselves. So yes, it would be easier for me to step in and explain how to not get your heart broken, but that's what shapes our feelings of ourselves and our feelings of competence in the world, is knowing how we've dealt with those difficult emotions. So, yeah, it would be much easier if I just told my kid moment to moment how to get through an airport. But then when something goes wrong or something is a little different, they're going to have no faith in themselves to figure out, those complicated things on their own. It can, wanting to do for them is great, and wanting to do help them not feel frustrated is great, unless you're creating, helpless kids who don't feel like they have any sort of faith in their ability to figure stuff out for themselves.
So part of that is, of course, you have to not save them from things. You have to not, as you write in the book, you have to not bring the paper when they finish their homework. They do it all perfectly, but they accidentally leave it on the kitchen table in the morning and go to school. You have to let them kind of figure that out on their own rather than bring it to school. But you kind of point out a funny situation in the book where you had that happen, but you actually were going to be heading to the school later that day anyway, so it would be no problem at all for you to just bring the homework and drop it off. And you had to make the difficult choice of, do I bring it, for my kid, or do I not? And you kind of got into like a Facebook debate about it with some people. How do you answer the question, which is, if it was your husband or if it was your friend and they made a mistake, you would help them out and you would go out of your way to bring them the thing that they left. But so why is it that for your kid that you make the choice not to do that?
Well, I think this is really important to point out that it's not that I would never, ever take anything to school for my kid. That I've had parents say to me, look, my kid, she's a great kid and she never forgets anything. And she's really, really organized. And this one time she forgot this thing. Why can't I take it to her? And I said, I never said that. I said that what we should try to do is to give kids opportunities to learn from their mistakes. And so in the example that I was talking about in the book, my younger son, who is now at the time he was like 9 or 10, and now he's 16 and doing great. And at the time, his executive function skills were really weak. And those are lots of different skills. But the one that he was having a lot of trouble with was remembering to take that piece of homework, finish it, put it in his backpack, and then take it out of his backpack once he got to school and hand it to his teacher. And so we were working really specifically on that skill. And of course, he left the homework at home on the desk. And the Facebook discussion that you're mentioning it was actually the most interesting part of that was with this woman named Lisa Heffernan, who actually runs a wonderful website called Grown and Flown. And it's about older kids and sort of supporting them as they're going out into the world. And Lisa said exactly that.
We actually just had Lisa on the podcast last week. She was fantastic.
Fantastic. Yes, that's who that message was from. And she said, no, Jess. I mean, I totally respect you. I respect your work. But as a family, we're supposed to have each other's backs. That's kind of our job, is that, when the rest of the world is falling apart, we're the one source of love and support and respect and blah, blah, blah. And I thought about that a lot, and I realized, and she said, so for example, if your husband left his laptop charger or whatever at home, that you would take it to him at his office, especially if you were going to be out anyway. And I absolutely would. I've done it a million times.
Right.
But at the same time, the answer to that question is that I'm married to a 52-year-old person who never forgets stuff and I'm not raising him. I'm raising kids who are working through building their executive function skills. I am my kids' training wheels until they can sort of balance and move off and go off into the world on their own. And part of that means that I have to give them these opportunities to feel the repercussions of their actions. My husband is resourceful enough to be able to ask someone else to borrow or to just make do and figure out a way until tomorrow. But my kid, what I want for my kid is not, I don't care so much that he forgot that that homework today. What I care about is that he puts the routines, the strategies in place so that next time he will remember that homework. I want him to be the kind of person who can have a positive adaptive response to his mistakes and make himself better for next time, figure out what wasn't working, try to come up with strategy. And what ended up happening that day, actually, when he was 9 and he was in 4th grade with a fantastic teacher named Mr. Dano. Mr. Dano kept him in from recess that day, which is, by the way, not something I approve of. I think the kids who need recess most are the ones who get kept in most often.
Gosh, isn't
Can't
that
keep
true?
kids, cannot keep kids in from recess as a disciplinary measure. But he did, and whatever, it worked. Kept him in from recess, didn't let him go back out until he, even after he finished the homework, he said to Finn, he said, this has been going on for long enough. And what I'd like for you to do is to sit here and come up with a strategy so that tomorrow you won't forget your homework. What can you come up with as a strategy? And it was this amazing moment because my kid came home that day. And I said, how did things go? And he's like, yeah, it went fine. It was a great day, whatever. And I said, yeah, but what about the homework? And he said, oh, Mr. Dano kept me in and that kind of stank. And I hated that. But he told me I had to come up with a strategy. So I did. I came up with a checklist. I'm going to make myself a checklist and I think I'll put it on the refrigerator. And on that will be homework. And I promise you from that day until just about last year, this has been the first academic year that he has not put a checklist on the refrigerator, and I keep them. I have all the copies of them. He puts them on index cards. Every year he puts a new checklist on the refrigerator, and that's been the strategy that he came up with that day. He believes on his own, even though I had been suggesting it to him for ages, but that's not what was important. What was important to him is that it was his strategy that he came up with that day. And then that was the thing that he had buy-in on. And so for however many, it's been 7 years that he's been using those checklists, and they continue to work for him because as far as he's concerned, it's the strategy that he came up with himself. So that, that was a huge pivotal moment. Not taking that homework that day led to one of those times when he had to talk to an adult about how to do better. And it changed a lot of things for my kid.
Isn't it true that you just don't make a change until something happens that makes you say, man, I really need to get better at that, or I really need to change that. It's like for you to really make a big change in your life and re-examine kind of the way that you're living or your habits, you kind of do need to have a failure. You need to have something that makes you feel bad and that makes you really re-examine how you want to be.
Well, the nice thing about having those moments is that for kids, especially, they don't necessarily have to be their moments all the time. One of the things that we do a lot in our families, we talk through at dinner time, how we talk a lot about our goals. We try to set goals, short-term and long-term goals for ourselves every once in a while and just sort of check in with each other on those goals. And, when I have something go wrong at work, and believe me, there have been plenty of things I tell, because I tend to talk a lot about failure, I tend to get a lot of questions about my own failures, and I'm perfectly happy to talk about those because they're really important learning moments for me. But more than that, they've been really incredible learning opportunities for my kids because I talk about the struggles I'm having at work with them. So when we have a triumph in our family, when something finally goes really well, my kids don't think, oh, that was super easy. You just send off a pitch to a national newspaper and you get to write a column for that newspaper for 3 years. That's not how my career as a journalist worked. They got to see all the rejections and they got to see all the mistakes I made so that when the good stuff finally happened, they knew it was the product of a lot of hard work and resilience and all that kind of stuff we can talk until we're blue in the face about how our kids should do stuff. But if we're not modeling that for them, we're just the parents and the peanuts carrying, Charlie Brown. We're just the wah, 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 wah until they actually can see that we're putting our money where our mouth is. And we're actually, walking the walk, to mix metaphors, that we do what we are actually following our own best advice and show them that. That's, I don't know why we seem to think that we need to keep it a secret from our kids that we're not perfect, because they're
Yeah, right. We
completely,
need to maintain
they
this facade
totally
of,
know. They
yeah, right.
absolutely know. Yeah.
In your chapter on household duties, there's something I love. It's on page 84. You say, oh, and one last thing. If you go behind your child's back and redo the chore he's just finished to his satisfaction, even if it's after he's left the room, he'll notice. You'll be telling him through your actions not only that he's incompetent, but that you will finish the job if he's careless. This is one lesson that you don't want him to learn, both for his sake and for yours. And I thought that was just like such a important point. And
This is such
I
great
felt,
advice. I should really take it, but I reloaded the dishwasher after. So yesterday, my son, 6 years after this book was published, yesterday, 5.5, whatever, my son loaded all the glasses, all the short things on the bottom half of the dishwasher and a bunch of tall things on the top half. And
uh-oh.
it all higgledy-piggledy, no rhyme or reason to it. And he was standing right there. And I said, you know, this is the opposite of how it's supposed to be done. And he's like, it doesn't matter. And then he watched me redo it. So I absolutely 100% have to remind myself all the time. Do I want my kid to be the kind of kid that can do it, you know, that what I really need to keep my eye on is I want my kid to be the kind of kid that can do it right next time, not necessarily that he did it perfectly this time. And I completely undermined that just the other day. So this is like a constant work in progress for us. It's not like you learn as a parent how to do something and then you just nail it from there on out. It's such a process.
Right. So then, okay, what would be the proper response in that situation? You would just let the higgledy-piggledy dishes get shoved into the dishwasher and make some kind of a mess, or who knows what would happen?
No, I mean, honestly, the way I should have dealt with it is the way I often deal with things is instead of now just telling that kid, the younger kid in particular, although, we have lapses all the time with everyone, is, often what I'll do is ask the kid to come back and say, could you just look at the dishwasher and is there anything that you notice that's amiss? Or I could say, let me explain to you why this makes no sense and could you please redo it? Or what if I need, just, and not from a place of trying to shame him or make him feel stupid, but that if he does it wrong, then I'm just left with having to do the work anyway. And that's not what we do to each other as a family. Like I would never do something for him, but do it in a really half-assed way so that he has to come back and redo it. That's, I just would never do that. And so
Right.
a lot of time that's one of the other things we do a lot is we talk about, that whole building empathy for other people and say, how would you feel if so-and-so did this to you and just turned the tables? And I think because our kids tend to think that it's our job as parents to do these things for kids, and believe me, they make me very, very happy to do them. I love showing my love by cooking a good meal and, making their lives a little easier when they need help. But in the meantime, what I'm also trying to do is make it really clear that they're part of this family. And when we support each other, that's how we function as family. It's not like they're not going to be paid for for doing household duties around the house because I don't get paid for doing household duties around the house. It's what we do because we support and love each other and respect each other. And so having all of those discussions come from there. So what I should have done was ask him to come back into the room, which of course always drives him bonkers, and say, actually, thanks for giving it a shot the first time, but as you may recall, tall things have to go on the bottom and the shorter things have to go on the top. So could you fix that so that we can actually fit more dishes in the dishwasher? And he's pretty good. Both of my kids tend to be pretty good about that. But at the same time, they're kids and they're going to have lapses where like all of a sudden they forget that the dishwasher exists in the first place and everything just goes in the sink. And then we have another conversation. It's, I wrote an article. I used to write this column for the New York Times called the Parent Teacher Conference. And the very last piece I ever wrote for that column was one about parenting being a long haul progress, a long haul process, a long haul job, not, this short-term function in the emergency thing. When we work from the daily emergencies, we tend to get it pretty wrong. But what I'm always trying to do is think ahead to where I want my kid to be in 6 months, in a year. And in that article, I said to my editor at the time, I said, my kid has suddenly forgotten how to do laundry. Like, I know he knows how to do it. It's like it's like it's erased from his memory or something, like he had a memory wipe. And at the same time, she said, yeah, but think about how far he's come since this time last year. Think about where he was a year ago. And I think we tend to lose perspective, long-term perspective, on just how competent our kids become when we let them become that. It's just, it's a process of constantly having to remind ourselves that it's a becoming, not a, okay, this lesson has been learned. We're now done. We can check that off the list and we never have to talk about it ever again. The dishwasher will be a constantly recurring discussion, I'm sure. We will not get it right, probably ever, but that's okay. It's a process.
We get closer
until
and
they have to
closer
load their
perfection.
own. Well, at some point they're going to have to load their own dishwashers. And at that point, I just hope like a little voice in their head says, oh yeah, she said something about how if you put the big, huge pots on the bottom, no water will ever make it to the top of the dishwasher. And, it'll, then he'll say, oh, I should have listened to that 6 years ago.
She did know a thing or two, that lady. We are here with Jessica Lahey talking about her book, The Gift of Failure. And we're not done yet. Here's a look at what's coming up in the second half of the show.
Social jostling and bullying can look a lot alike.
You write in this book that middle school is a setup because kids are set up to fail in middle school. What do you mean by that? How is middle school a setup, and what should parents do about it?
I tell a story in the book about a kid who had attention issues and was in my class, and he threw a pen across the classroom and it nearly hit me in the head. When I asked him sort of what he was thinking right before he threw the pen, he said very honestly that he wasn't. He honestly had acted before he'd even engaged in the thinking process about what was going to happen. And, if you spend any time at all around kids, you've seen this before. The one line I would love to draw for you right now, though, is a lot of parents ask me about how they can get their kid to keep their room clean. And I'm going to say one little thing about that, which is that.
Want to hear the full interview? Sign up for a subscription today. You get unlimited access to all the interviews I've conducted. It's completely affordable, and your subscription helps support the work we do here at Talking to Teens. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.